You don't need to pretend, the giant Apache told the Comanche bride, and then she revealed everything. Dust swirls in the hot church air. A bride stands trembling at the altar, lace dress clinging, eyes hiding a terrible secret. The cattleman's son smirks. This marriage isn't about love. It's about land. About water. About power. But when the giant Apache steps through the church doors, his voice rumbles like thunder. You don't need to pretend. The room gasps. The bride's mask shatters. And before the whole town, she confesses she already belongs to another. And she carries a child that could change the fate of the valley. Now whispers turn to fury. Ranch hands tighten their fists. The cattle baron makes his move. And the shack in the hills is no longer safe. As fire spreads, as guns wait in the pot in shadows, and as the storm of prejudice rises, will truth and mercy be enough to protect her child, and can love between outcasts stand against the greed of an entire town? Every story begins with a heartbeat. Tell me, where are you in the world today, and how are you really doing? Your words make this space feel more human. The summer heat pressed heavy through the windows of Los Arbol's whitewashed church, making the paper fans flutter like nervous butterflies in the hands of the townsfolk. Dust motes danced in the shafts of morning light that streamed through the glass, catching on the pressed Sunday suits and cotton dresses of those gathered for what promised to be the valley's most talked-about wedding of the year. Nira stood at the altar, her borrowed lace dress scratching at her neck and wrists. The stiff fabric felt foreign against her skin, so different from the soft deerskin and cotton she usually wore. Her dark eyes fixed on the rough wooden floorboards as whispers rippled through the congregation like wind through prairie grass. Did you hear? Clayton Draper's boy finally caught himself at Indian widow. Sure to be trouble, mixing like that. At least she's Christian now, or so they say. The murmurs stung, but Nira held herself still, the way her mother had taught her. Pride lived in the spine, not in words. Besides, she knew what the townsfolk couldn't see, how her hands trembled beneath her borrowed gloves, how each breath felt like drawing in smoke. Beside her, Elias Draper preened in his new store-bought suit, his watch chain glinting as he shifted from foot to foot. His eyes kept darting to the land deed tucked in his breast pocket rather than to her face. That piece of paper meant more to him than any bride could. The elderly Reverend Morris dabbed his forehead with a handkerchief, his voice wavering in the stuffy air as he began the ceremony. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today. Nira's vision blurred. The words washed over her like muddy river water, meaningless and cold. This wasn't how marriage should be. Among her people, unions were celebrated under open skies, with drums and singing, with families sharing food and stories. Not this sterile performance of words she barely understood. If anyone can show just cause why this couple cannot lawfully be joined together in matrimony, let them speak now or forever hold their peace. The traditional pause stretched out, heavy with unsaid things. Then, from the back of the church came the slow creak of wooden doors opening. A shadow fell across the threshold, and a deep voice that seemed to rise from the earth itself spoke. You don't need to pretend. The congregation turned as one, fans freezing mid-flutter. Dakota filled the doorway, his broad shoulders nearly touching both sides of the frame. He held his hat in his weathered hands, but there was nothing submissive in his stance. His eyes, dark and steady as mountain pools, found Nira's across the space between them. Land Spirit, one of the children whispered, using the name the settlers' young ones had given him. Awed by his size and silence, Elias's face flushed red. Get out of here, Apache. This is a Christian ceremony. But Dakota didn't move. He didn't raise his voice or clench his fists. He simply stood, solid as the hills themselves, and spoke again to Nira. Your heart knows the truth. Honor it. Something broke inside Nira then, not like glass shattering, but like ice melting in spring. The tears she'd held back for so long spilled down her cheeks, cutting trails through the powder the settler women had insisted she wear. I cannot marry you, Elias, she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. I am already bound by the laws of my people, my husband. Her hand drifted to her stomach, where new life grew beneath her heart. My husband was killed by soldiers 6 moons ago. Our marriage was true and blessed by the elders. I cannot, will not, pretend it meant nothing. Gasps erupted from the pews. Mrs. Henderson, the baker's wife, actually crossed herself. Clayton Draper, Elias's father, surged to his feet, his face purple with rage. You dare make a mockery of this? After all we've done to civilize you? But Naira stood straighter, letting the borrowed gloves fall to the floor. I have made no mockery. The mockery was in asking me to deny who I am, who I loved, the child I carry, my husband's child. The last words fell like stones into still water. More gasps, more whispers, some angry, some shocked, some from the women who had known loss. Themselves understanding, Elias lunged forward, grabbing for Naira's arm. You think you can shame me like this, in my own church? Before he could reach her, Dakota was there, moving with a speed that belied his size. He didn't touch Elias, didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to make the younger man stumble back. This is not your church, Dakota said quietly. The house of the Creator belongs to all who seek truth. And the truth stands before you now. The Reverend Morris, who had been silent throughout the exchange, cleared his throat. Perhaps? We should all take a moment to pray for guidance. But Naira was already moving, her step sure despite her tears. She walked down the aisle, past the shocked faces, past the judgment and the pity. Dakota stepped aside, letting her pass through the doorway first, into the sunlight and fresh air beyond. Behind them, chaos erupted in the church. Voices raised in anger and argument, Elias's curses mixing with his father's threats and the confused questions of the congregation. But out here, under the vast Texas sky, those sounds seemed small and far away. Naira pulled the scratchy lace veil from her hair, letting the wind catch it. Thank you, she whispered, not looking at Dakota. I didn't have the courage alone. You have always had courage, he answered. You only needed to remember it. The sound of boots on wooden steps made them both turn. Several of the townsfolk were emerging from the church, their faces a mix of emotions. The story was far from over. There would be consequences, challenges, hard days ahead. But for now, Naira stood in the truth of who she was and found that. Her hands had finally stopped trembling. Inside the small church, the initial shocked silence shattered like a glass hitting stone. Voices rose in a tide of outrage and furious whispers, bouncing off the whitewashed walls and wooden beams. Ladies clutched their fans to their breasts while men shifted forward in their seats, faces reddening beneath their Sunday best. Elias. Draper's lips curled into an ugly sneer as he jabbed a finger toward Naira. Dishonor? You want to talk about dishonor? His voice cracked like a whip in the stuffy air. Coming here in borrowed finery, pretending to be something you're not? But it was Clayton Draper's reaction that sent a chill through the congregation. Where his son burned with hot anger, the cattle baron's face held something far more dangerous, a cold, calculated smirk that didn't reach his eyes. He rose slowly from his front row pew, brushing invisible dust from his black vest. Well now, he drawled, his voice carrying easily over the commotion. Since we're all being so honest today, maybe it's time for some plain speaking. He turned to address the congregation rather than Naira, like a man holding court. You think my boy here was sweet on the girl? That this was some kind of love match? The whispers died down as people leaned forward, hungry for the truth Clayton dangled before them. That spring on her land is the only reliable water source for 10 miles in the dry season. Controls that spring, controls the whole valley. He chuckled, but the sound held no warmth. Ain't that right, son? Elias straightened his vest, looking pleased to finally drop the pretense. That's right, Pa. Easier to marry the land than buy it, especially when some people don't know its true worth. A different kind of silence fell over the church then. Not the shocked kind from before, but something heavier, the weight of ugly truth laid bare. Several of the farmers present exchanged knowing looks. Water meant everything out here, where drought could destroy a year's work in a matter of weeks. Naira's fingers clutched at her borrowed shawl, knuckles white against the delicate fabric. Her voice, when it came, was soft but clear as a bell. In the hushed church, I know exactly what the spring is worth. To my people, to the creatures who drink there, to the land itself. Her hand drifted to rest protectively over her stomach. My husband knew too. That's why he made me promise never to sell, never to let it be fenced off from those who need it. She lifted her chin, meeting Clayton's cold stare. I carry his child beneath my heart. Would you have me betray both father and baby for your cattle empire?" The words fell like stones into still water. Women gasped, several making the sign of the cross. Men shifted uncomfortably, some looking away. Even those who had been angriest seemed unsure now, caught between greed and the age-old respect for motherhood. Clayton's face darkened. "Defiance won't serve you well out here, girl. A woman alone. She is not alone." Dakota's deep voice rolled through the church like distant thunder. He stepped forward, his shadow falling across Clayton Draper. Though he made no threatening moves, his sheer presence seemed to fill the space, solid as the mountains themselves. "The spring will remain as it has always been, free for all who respect its gifts." The Reverend Morris, who had been standing forgotten at his pulpit, finally found his voice. It quavered slightly as he spoke. I think perhaps we should end here. Go home, all of you. Pray for guidance in these difficult matters." He mopped his brow with a handkerchief. "Go home now, please." People began to file out, but the atmosphere had turned dangerous. Groups of men clustered on the church steps, voices low and angry. "Can't let them make fools of us," one muttered. "Run them both out," another agreed. "Show them what happens to troublemakers." Dakota's hand found Naira's elbow, gentle but urgent. "This way," he murmured, guiding her toward a side door that led to the church garden. The late afternoon sun slanted long shadows across the packed earth, painting everything in gold and amber. His horse, a sturdy paint, stood waiting where he'd left it. Naira hesitated at the door, torn between fear of what lay ahead and relief at escaping the suffocating tension inside. The borrowed lace at her throat suddenly felt like it was choking her. "Trust me," Dakota said simply, reading the conflict in her eyes. "I know safe paths through the foothills. They won't follow us there." Behind them, the voices grew louder, more threatening. Clayton Draper's commanding tone rose above the others. "Find them. Don't let them." Naira didn't wait to hear more. She gathered her skirts and hurried to the horse. Dakota's strong hands lifted her easily into the saddle before he swung up behind her. They moved out at a steady trot, not rushing obviously enough to draw immediate pursuit, but putting distance between themselves and the church with every hoofbeat. The whispers followed them down the dusty street like wind-blown leaves. Savage. Heathen marriage. Hidden child. But Naira sat straighter as they rode, letting the borrowed shawl slip from her shoulders. The setting sun caught the beadwork on her dress beneath, her own handiwork, hidden under the settler's clothes, making it gleam like stars against the darkening sky. They turned north toward the purple shadows of the foothills, leaving the church and its judgment behind. The wind carried the faint sound of raised voices and slammed doors, but ahead lay only the vast, open land and the promise of safety in its wild embrace. The paint horse's hooves kicked up small clouds of dust as Dakota guided them higher into the foothills. The sun hung low on the horizon, painting the western sky in deep oranges and purples. Naira sat straight in the saddle ahead of him, her borrowed wedding dress gathering trail dust, but her posture remained proud despite the day's turmoil. They followed narrow trails that wound between granite outcrops and stands of juniper. As they climbed, the air grew cooler and carried the scent of pine. Dakota kept them moving at a steady pace, occasionally glancing back down the slope to ensure no riders followed. "Not much further," he said softly, his deep voice barely carrying. Over the creak of leather and the horse's steady breathing. "There's a place ahead where we can rest." Just as the last rays of sunlight slipped behind the ridgeline, they crested a small rise. There, tucked against a grove of ponderosa pines, stood a weathered line shack. The simple cabin's log walls had gone silver with age, but the stone chimney stood solid. A small corral made of split rails leaned against one side. Dakota dismounted. First, then helped Naira down from the saddle. Her legs trembled slightly from the long ride, but she steadied herself quickly. He led the horse to the corral while she stood taking in her surroundings, arms wrapped around herself in the cooling evening air. The cabin door creaked as Dakota pushed it open. Inside, the single room smelled of pine pitch and old wood smoke. A rough-hewn table with two mismatched chairs occupied the center. Against one wall stood a cast-iron cook stove, and against another, a narrow bed with a wool blanket. Simple shelves. held basic provisions, flour, coffee, dried beans. Nira stepped inside slowly, her hand trailing along the table's scarred surface. After a week of pretending to fit into the settler's world, the cabin's honest simplicity felt like drawing. A deep breath after being underwater too long. "You'll be safe here," Dakota said, moving to kindle a fire in the stove. "No one comes this high except to check fence lines, and that won't be for weeks yet." While he went outside to chop more wood, Nira found herself drawn to the practical task of making supper. She discovered a sack of cornmeal and some flour on the shelves. Her fingers remembered the motions of mixing cornbread, even if the bowl was dented tin instead of her usual clay. The rhythmic thunk of the axe outside blended with the cabin's creaks and settlings. Through the small window, she could see Dakota's tall form moving with steady purpose, each swing precise. The domestic sounds and actions helped calm her racing thoughts. When Dakota returned with an armload of split pine, the cabin had grown warm from the stove. The cornbread's sweet scent filled the air. They sat across from each other at the table, the silence between them comfortable at first, then heavy with unspoken words. Finally, Nira's quiet voice broke the stillness. "I should tell you about my husband." Her fingers traced patterns on the wooden tabletop. "His name was Morning Star. We married when I was 16, according to our ways. The spring on our land, it had belonged to his family for generations. He knew every stone, every tree around it." She paused, gathering strength. "Last winter, soldiers came through. They'd lost their way in a storm, were desperate for water. Morning Star offered to share, as we always did. But when he approached their camp," her voice caught. "They shot him. Claimed later they thought he meant harm. Left me alone with the land in his memory." Dakota sat motionless, his dark eyes fixed on her face. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of shared pain. "My family was taken during the long walk. I was hunting when the soldiers came. Returned to find empty hogans and tracks leading south." His broad hands clasped together on the table. "I followed as far as I could. Found only scattered graves along the trail. Since then, silence has been my closest companion." Nira looked up at him then, really seeing him. Beyond his intimidating size lay a gentleness born of deep understanding. Here was someone else who knew how grief could reshape a life like water. Carving stone, the lamp's flame flickered, casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls. Outside, the wind had begun to rise, carrying the first hints of an approaching storm. Nira cleared away their simple supper things, then settled in the chair near the stove. Almost without thinking, she began to hum, a Comanche lullaby her mother had sung, her hand resting protectively over the subtle curve of her belly. The tune wove through the growing darkness, speaking of stars and prairie winds and a mother's love. Dakota sat quietly, his eyes half closed, letting the melody fill the spaces between them. Thunder rolled in the distance, drawing closer. Soon rain drummed against the cabin's roof, while wind rattled the shutters. Dakota banked the fire for the night and spread his bedroll near the door, leaving the narrow bed for Nira, but sleep proved elusive for both of them. Nira lay awake, listening to the storm's fury, knowing that this temporary shelter was just the beginning. Below in the valley, the Drapers would be plotting, gathering allies. Their alliance, born of desperate circumstances, was as yet untested. Across the dark room, she could hear Dakota's steady breathing. He too lay awake, his thoughts likely running along similar paths. The storm would pass, but morning would bring new challenges. For now, though, they had found a moment of peace, two wounded souls sharing the shelter of understanding. The rain continued its steady rhythm on the roof, while lightning occasionally illuminated the cabin in brief, bright flashes. Neither spoke again, but the silence between them had changed. Where before it held the weight of unshared stories, now it carried the first delicate threads of trust, spun from the simple act of witnessing each other's pain. Dawn painted the eastern sky in gentle pinks and golds, chasing away the storm clouds of the previous night. Dakota stood at the cabin door, studying the clearing morning. His keen eyes noted fresh puddles in the yard and how the wind had scattered pine needles across the wet earth. "I need to ride into town," he said, turning to where Nira stirred cornmeal mush on the stove. "We're low on flour and lamp oil." Nira nodded, trying to hide her unease at being left alone. "The garden needs tending," she said, gesturing to the small plot beside the cabin where spring vegetables struggled through the rocky soil. "I'll keep busy." Dakota saddled his paint horse, checking the cinch twice before mounting. "Bar the door while I'm gone," he advised, his deep voice gentle but firm. "I'll return by afternoon." He wheeled the horse around and headed down the trail, his broad shoulders straight against the morning light dot in town. The mercantile's bell jangled as Dakota ducked through the doorway. The usual morning bustle died away as heads turned. Women drew closer together, whispering behind raised hands. Men's faces hardened, some spitting on the wooden sidewalk outside. "Giant savage," one man muttered, loud enough to carry. Others nodded, their hostile stares following Dakota as he moved through the store. The owner, Mr. Peterson, watched warily as Dakota gathered his supplies: flour, lamp oil, matches, and salt. His movements were deliberate, careful not to knock anything over in the crowded aisles. Years of such treatment had taught him to make himself smaller, less threatening, though his height made that impossible doubt as he approached the counter. Widow Matthews stepped forward. Her gray hair was neat under her bonnet, her eyes kind despite the disapproving glances from other customers. She slipped extra items onto the counter: a bar of soap, a packet of coffee beans. "For the girl with child," she whispered, pressing the items toward him. Her weathered hands folded together. "I'm praying for you both." Dakota inclined his head in silent thanks, paying for his purchases. The weight of stares followed him out onto the street, where he secured the supplies in his saddlebags. The morning had grown warm, but the chill of the townspeople's reception clung to him as he started the ride back to the cabin. Meanwhile, at the line shack, Nira worked in the small garden plot. Her hands moved steadily through the soil, pulling weeds from around the tender shoots of beans and squash. The physical work helped quiet her mind, though she found herself glancing often at the surrounding hills. Near midday, movement caught her eye: riders, distant but clear against the sky. They moved slowly along the ridgeline, stopping occasionally to study the valley below. Even at this distance, she recognized the draper's distinctive paint horses. Her heart quickened, but she forced herself to continue working, pretending not to notice the watchers. The scouts circled the higher ground throughout the morning, never approaching directly but making their presence known. Fear clawed at Nira's throat, but she kept to her tasks: hauling water, tending the garden, sweeping the cabin's plank floor. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her afraid. When Dakota returned in the late afternoon, his expression darkened at the sight of horse tracks in the mud near the spring. He dismounted quickly, scanning the hills with narrow eyes while unpacking the supplies. "They were watching most of the morning," Nira said quietly as they carried things inside. "3 riders on the ridge." Dakota nodded, his jaw tight. "They'll be reporting back to Clayton Draper." He stowed the supplies carefully, then checked the cabin's few windows, noting angles of approach, places where shadows could hide movement. They prepared supper in near silence, the weight of the day's tensions heavy between them. As Nira set out bowls of beans and the last of the cornbread, she paused. "Thank you for the coffee," she said softly. "It's been so long since I've had any." Dakota looked up, something gentle crossing his stern features. Widow Matthews sent it. There are still some kind hearts in town. The evening settled around them, crickets beginning their nightly chorus outside the cabin walls. The lamp's glow softened the rough interior, making it feel almost cozy despite their circumstances. Nira sat in the chair by the stove, her mending forgotten in her lap. "I realized something today," she said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I haven't laughed in months, not since." She trailed off, fingers twisting in her skirt. Dakota was quiet for so long she thought he might not respond. Then his deep voice filled the cabin, carrying an unexpected note of humor. "When I was younger," he began, "I thought myself quite the horseman. One summer, I was showing off for the elders, riding a particularly stubborn mule." His lips twitched at the memory. That mule had other ideas. Waited until I was mid-boast, then stopped dead. I went flying right into a patch of prickly pear. The image struck something loose in Nira's chest. A small laugh escaped her, surprising them both. Then another, and another, until she was truly laughing, the sound bright and real in the quiet cabin. Dakota's own deep chuckle joined hers, warming the space between them. Her laughter faded to hiccups, then to a smile that lingered. For just a moment, the weight of their situation lifted. The watching riders, the town's hostility, even their shared grief seemed less overwhelming in the wake of that simple joy. Outside, the crickets sang on. Inside, something had shifted, subtle, as a change in the wind, but just as significant. They were no longer just two people thrown together by circumstance. They had shared laughter, and with it, the first fragile sprout of friendship had taken root. The days settled into a gentle rhythm at the line shack, each sunrise bringing new tasks and quiet moments shared between Nera and Dakota. The mountain air carried the fresh scent of pine and wild sage. While mornings dawned crisp and clear, Dakota worked steadily on the cabin's worn roof, replacing weathered shingles with fresh-cut ones he'd split himself. The steady tap of his hammer echoed across the small clearing. From her spot by the garden, Nera watched his shore movements, noting how he treated each task with careful attention, as if the simple cabin deserved the same respect as any grand house. Inside, Nera stirred a pot of rabbit stew, adding wild onions she'd gathered from near the spring. Her fingers worked swiftly, mending a tear in one of Dakota's shirts. The familiar motion of needle and thread soothed her, reminding her of peaceful evenings in her grandmother's lodge. "This pattern," she said one afternoon, showing Dakota the intricate beadwork on her shawl, "tells the story of water blessing. The earth." Her fingers traced the blue and white designs. "Each bead is placed with a prayer for rain." Dakota studied the pattern with interest, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he touched the careful work. "Beautiful," he said softly, "like stars fallen to earth." That evening, as twilight painted the sky in deep purples, Dakota pointed upward. "We call that one So-Yaz," he said, indicating a bright star. "The little star that guides hunters home." Nera repeated the Apache word carefully, tasting its shape. They spent the next hour sharing the names of constellations, their words mixing like streams joining to form a river. The sound of wagon wheels one evening brought them both alert. Dakota moved to the door, stance protective, but relaxed when he recognized the visitors, the Warner sisters, Martha and Ruth, from the valley's north end. "We brought fresh bread," Martha announced, her gray hair neat under her bonnet. She held out a covered basket, "and some preserves from last summer's berries." Ruth, the younger sister, smiled warmly at Nera. "Not everyone agrees with Clayton Draper's ways," she said quietly. "Some of us remember how it feels to be alone with land to protect." The sisters settled at the rough table while Nera served tea in mismatched cups. Their chatter filled the cabin with a homey feeling that had been missing since the failed wedding. "That spring water's meant for everyone," Ruth declared, stirring honey into her tea. "Not just those with the biggest herds. The Drapers forget. They were newcomers once too." Martha nodded firmly. "You stand your ground, dear," she told Nera. "You'll find more friends than enemies if people listen to their hearts instead of their fears." As the sisters' wagon disappeared down the trail, Nera felt something warm bloom in her chest. Hope, tentative but real. The simple gift of bread and kind words had strengthened her more than she'd expected. Later that night, as they sat by the stove, Dakota's expression grew troubled. "I fear I've brought you more hardship," he said, his deep voice heavy with concern. "The town's anger at me makes your path harder." Nera looked around the cabin, at the swept floor, the mended curtain, the herbs drying from rafters. "This place," she said softly, "feels more like home than the Draper Ranch ever did." Her hand rested on her growing belly. "Here, I can breathe, be myself." Dakota's eyes held hers for a long moment, understanding passing between them without words. As dusk approached the next evening, they sat together on the cabin's small porch. The air was sweet with cooling earth and blooming wildflowers. Above the meadow, bats darted and wheeled, their silent dance a celebration of evening's arrival. Mountains stood purple against the fading sky, eternal and peaceful. For a precious moment, the world felt perfectly still. No threats, no fears, just the gentle presence of two souls finding unexpected peace in each other's company. Dakota's voice carried a note of warning when he finally spoke. "Peace never lasts long when greedy men thirst for water." His eyes scanned the darkening valley below, where the Drapers' influence stretched like lengthening shadows. Naira's hand found his, her grip firm despite her smaller fingers. She said nothing, but her touch spoke volumes of determination, of courage, of the strength to stand firm against whatever storms approached. The land was her child's birthright, a sacred trust she would not surrender. They sat together as stars began appearing, each lost in thought but anchored by their joined hands and shared resolve. And the bats continued their twilight dance, free and untroubled by the concerns of those watching from below. The morning sun cast long shadows as townsfolk filed into the whitewashed church, their Sunday best dulled by the dusty wind. Naira drew, her cloak tighter, slipping into a back pew with Dakota beside her. His presence, solid as the mountains, gave her strength to endure what was coming. Whispers rippled through the congregation like wind through dry grass. Ladies adjusted their bonnets to steal backward glances. Children twisted in their seats until stern mothers turned them forward again. Naira kept her eyes on her worn hymnal. Though the English words blurred before her, the familiar creak of floorboards announced Reverend Matthews's arrival at the pulpit. He cleared his throat, surveying his flock with troubled eyes before beginning his sermon. "Brothers and sisters," his voice rang out, "we gather today to discuss a matter weighing heavy on all our hearts." He gripped the wooden pulpit, knuckles whitening. "The Lord set forth his divine order, separating the nations of men. When we defy his wisdom by mixing what should remain pure, we invite his judgment upon our lands." Naira's hands trembled in her lap. Dakota remained still as stone, but she felt tension radiating from his frame. "These unions between savage and civilized folk mock God's plan," Matthews continued, his voice rising. "They bring confusion to the natural order, and those who aid such arrangements." His eyes swept the congregation, lingering on the Warner sisters who had shown kindness to Naira. "They too shall answer for their part in this corruption." Martha Warner's chin lifted defiantly. Her sister Ruth's hand found hers in silent solidarity. "The very ground beneath our feet cries out," Matthews declared. "When we allow heathens to claim Christian lands, to hold God's precious resources hostage," he paused, letting his words sink in, "we invite drought, pestilence, and the Lord's righteous anger." Naira's child stirred within her as if protesting these harsh pronouncements. She pressed a hand to her belly, drawing comfort from that small life. The sermon seemed endless, each word another stone in a wall being built between Naira and the community she'd hoped might accept her. When Matthews finally called for the closing hymn, her throat was too tight to join in. As the congregation began to disperse, Matthews approached their pew. His expression had softened from righteous fury to something more uncertain. He glanced over his shoulder before speaking in low tones. "I must warn you both," he said, twisting his hands. "There's talk in town, dangerous talk. For your own safety and the child's, you should leave while you can." Dakota's voice rumbled like distant thunder. "The land is hers by right. We will not be driven off by threats." Matthews sighed heavily. "Rights mean little to angry men with rifles, son." He touched his Bible. "I pray I'm wrong about what's coming." Outside the church, the morning had grown hot and still. Naira stood in the shade of an oak tree, waiting while Dakota brought their horse around. Women began approaching her, one by one, with furtive glances toward the men gathered by the hitching posts. Ruth Warner pressed a small bundle into her hands. "Dried raspberry leaf," she whispered. "For when your time comes," her eyes were kind. "Every mother needs help, no matter what some folks say." Another woman, her face lined with years of sun and work, offered a beautifully woven shawl. "My grandmother made this," she said softly. "She came west in a wagon, carrying hope for a better life, just like you're carrying hope now." More came forward, a loaf of fresh bread here, a jar of preserve there, each gift accompanied by a quiet word of encouragement or gentle touch. These women knew the weight of bearing children in harsh lands. They understood the strength it took to stand alone. The ride back to the line shack was silent, each lost in their own thoughts. The sun had passed its peak when they arrived, throwing mountain shadows across the small clearing. Inside, Naira carefully arranged her gifts on the rough table. The shawl's bright colors seemed to mock the darkness gathering in her heart. Finally, the tears she'd held back all morning broke free. "How can they hate so easily?" she asked, her voice breaking. My child isn't even born, yet they've already judged him worthless. Her hands cradled her growing belly. What kind of world will he face? Dakota knelt beside her chair, his large hands gentle as they covered hers. Your son will be strong, he said softly. Like the rivers that join in the valley, he will carry the wisdom of two peoples in his heart. His eyes held hers steadily. A child of two nations is not a curse, but a bridge between worlds. Through him, others may learn to see with new eyes. Nira leaned into his strength, letting his words wash over her like cool water. A bridge, she repeated, tasting the hope in that image. Not a division, but a connection. The afternoon waned as they worked together, securing the cabin against the trouble they both knew was coming. Dakota reinforced the door hinges while Nira fitted tight-woven cloth over the windows to block arrows or bullets while letting in light. My mother used to say that hatred burns hottest just before it dies, Dakota said as he tested the new shutters. Like a lamp running out of oil. Nira sorted the dried herbs from Ruth, arranging them carefully in her medicine pouch. The women. Today, she said thoughtfully, they weren't afraid to show kindness, even with the men watching. Perhaps that's how change begins, not with grand speeches, but with small acts of courage. Dakota nodded, understanding in his eyes. They worked until sunset, transforming the simple cabin into a fortress. Every spare moment, their hands would find each other, sharing strength and comfort without words. As evening settled over the mountains, they sat together on the porch steps. The air was sweet with pine sap and late-blooming wildflowers. Somewhere in the forest, a mourning dove called to its mate. Nira ran her fingers over the gifted shawl's intricate pattern. These women, she said softly, they've given me more than just things. They've given me hope that my child might find acceptance, even in this divided world. Dakota's arms settled around her shoulders, warm and protective. Together they watched the stars emerge, each one a pinpoint of light pushing back the darkness. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, they had this moment of peace, and the knowledge that even in the hardest times, kindness could still bloom like flowers through stone. Dawn painted the eastern sky in whispers of pink and gold as Dakota and Nira rode toward the ridge. The horses' hooves crunched softly on frost-dusted grass, their breath forming delicate clouds in the crisp morning air. Nira held tight to Dakota's waist as they climbed higher, the familiar landscape of her homeland spreading out below them. The spring came into view as they crested the final rise. Misty tendrils rose from the water's surface like spirits dancing in the early light. Nira's breath caught at the sight. No matter how many times she visited this place, its beauty always struck her anew. Dakota helped her down from the horse, his large hands gentle at her waist. They walked together to the spring's edge, where clear water bubbled up from deep within the earth. Ancient cottonwoods stood guard around the pool, their leaves whispering secrets in the morning breeze. This place, Nira said softly, kneeling, to touch the water's surface. It has belonged to my people since before memory. The ripples from her fingers spread in perfect circles. When I married, my husband made a sacred vow to protect it. Her voice caught. His last words to me were about keeping it safe. Dakota stood silent beside her, his massive frame still as the stones around them. The rising sun cast his shadow long across the water. The drapers see only cattle land and profit, she continued, rising slowly. They don't understand that this spring gives life to everything in the valley. My people believe the Creator placed it here as a blessing for all who live in peace. Her hand drifted to her growing belly, where her child stirred. Now the duty falls to me to guard this place, to keep it flowing free for all who need it. She turned to face Dakota, her dark eyes meeting his. For my child and for the generations to come. Dakota knelt by the water's edge, his large fingers trailing through the crystal surface. After a long moment, he spoke, his deep voice barely above a whisper. Water is life itself. My people know this truth in our bones. He stood, drawing himself to his full height. I swear to you, Nira, by all I hold sacred, I will help you protect this spring. No harm will come to it while I draw breath. The solemnity of his vow hung in the morning air. Nira felt tears prick at her eyes, not of sorrow this time, but of gratitude. She reached for his hand, and his fingers closed carefully around hers. Stayed by the spring until the sun climbed higher, watching the mist dissolve into the warming air. The water's quiet song spoke of permanence, of cycles unbroken since the world's beginning. Here, in this sacred place, Nera felt her ancestors' presence, their approval warming her heart. The ride back to the line shack was peaceful, filled with comfortable silence. But as they approached, Dakota suddenly sat straighter in the saddle. Nera peered around his broad shoulder to see several wagons parked in the clearing. Her heart jumped with fear until she recognized Martha Warner's dappled mare. As they drew closer, she saw familiar faces, the women from church, some of their husbands, even a few of the younger folk from town. They stood in a loose gathering, holding bundles and baskets. Dakota helped Nera down, positioning himself slightly in front of her as they approached the group. But Martha Warner stepped forward with a warm smile, her arms full of colorful quilts. "We thought you might need these," she said, offering the blankets to Nera. "Winter's coming on, and this cabin gets mighty cold up here." Others came forward then, bringing their gifts. There was smoked venison and salt pork, jars of preserved fruits, and bags of cornmeal. Ruth Warner presented a small leather-bound book filled with carefully copied hymn verses and Bible passages about love and acceptance. "For the little one," she explained, patting Nera's arm. "Every child should know songs of joy." A young man, barely more than a boy, shuffled forward with a wooden cradle. "Pa and I made this," he mumbled, not meeting their eyes. Ma said, "Well, every baby needs a proper place to sleep." Nera's vision blurred with tears as she took in these offerings of support. These weren't grand gestures or public declarations. They were quiet acts of defiance against hatred. Small seeds of change planted in fertile soil. The visitors didn't stay long. They knew too much attention might bring unwanted notice from the Drapers and their allies. But each one spoke a kind word or offered a gentle touch before leaving. Their wagons disappeared down the trail one by one, until only the gifts remained as proof they'd come. Dakota and Nera spent the afternoon finding places for everything. The cabin felt warmer somehow, filled with these tokens of friendship and hope. As sunset approached, they sat together on the porch steps, watching the sky paint itself in brilliant oranges and purples. Nera twisted her hands in her lap, gathering courage. Finally, she spoke. "Dakota," she said softly, "you've been more than just a protector to me these past weeks." She turned to face him. "Will you? Would you stand with me as family?" Dakota's broad shoulders tensed. He stared out at the darkening forest for so long that Nera feared she'd spoken too boldly. When he finally turned to her, his eyes held a vulnerability she'd never seen before. "I have walked alone for many years," he said, his deep voice rough with emotion. "After losing my family, I thought it better that way." His huge hands opened and closed in his lap. "I believed my size frightened people, that my silence made them uncomfortable. I convinced myself I was not meant for." He paused, searching for words, for closeness, for love. Nera reached out, placing her small hand over his large one. "You don't need to pretend with me," she said, echoing his words from that day in the church. "I see you, Dakota, all of you." He looked down at their joined hands, hers delicate and brown, his massive and weathered. Slowly, carefully, he turned his palm up to clasp her fingers. "Family," he said, as if tasting the word. A smile tugged at the corners of his mouth, transforming his solemn face. "Yes, we are family." Their hands remained clasped as the first stars appeared above the mountains. No more words were needed. Their hearts had found their path, like water, flowing true to its course. In the growing darkness, a whippoorwill called from the forest's edge. The sound carried across the clearing, lonely no longer, but filled with promise, like the first notes of a new song about to begin. Word traveled fast in Los Arbos, carried on whispers and knowing glances. By Monday morning, everyone had heard Dakota and Nera planned to marry. The news sparked fierce debate in the mercantile, at the smithy, and around kitchen tables throughout the valley. Clayton Draper stood on his ranch house porch, face twisted in disgust as his son Elias paced. "It's an abomination," the younger man spat. "That Apache giant and a Comanche woman living as husband and wife? It ain't natural." "Let them dig their own grave," Clayton replied, his cold eyes fixed on the distant foothills. "Their sin will be their undoing." But not everyone shared the Draper's view. In his small study behind the church, Reverend Matthews wrestled with his conscience. The worn pages of his Bible lay open before him as afternoon light streamed through dusty windows. His fingers traced familiar verses about love, mercy, and justice. When Dakota and Nera came to him that evening, the preacher's weathered face showed the weight of his decision. "I cannot perform a public ceremony," he said quietly, "but I believe God's love knows no boundaries." He closed his Bible gently. "I will give you a private blessing if you'll have it." Nera's eyes filled with tears as she squeezed Dakota's hand. The giant man bowed his head in gratitude. "We would be honored," he rumbled out. They chose the ridge above the sacred spring for their ceremony. As dusk painted the sky in deep purples and golds, small groups made their way up the winding trail. Martha and Ruth Ellison carried baskets of food and blankets. Tom Wilson, the blacksmith, brought torches to light the gathering. 2 Comanche elders, friends of Nera's family, arrived wrapped in their finest blankets. Dakota had built a fire circle ringed with stones. As darkness fell, the flames leaped high, casting dancing shadows on the faces of their small congregation. The night air carried the scent of sage and pine. Nera wore a dress of soft buckskin, decorated with intricate beadwork that caught the firelight. Her dark hair fell loose down her back, adorned with a single eagle feather. Dakota stood tall. In his best shirt, his long hair tied back with a leather thong, his face solemn but his eyes bright with joy. Reverend Matthews spoke first, his voice carrying clear in the evening air. "We gather here under God's own stars to witness this sacred union." He held up his hands. "Though their paths began far apart, the Creator has brought these 2 hearts together in love." The Comanche elders stepped forward next. The older woman, her face etched with years of wisdom, spoke in her native tongue before translating. "Our people say that when 2 rivers join, they make a stronger current." She smiled at Nera. "Your mother would be proud to see you choose with your heart." In the firelight, Nera turned to face Dakota. Her voice trembled slightly as she placed her small hand over his heart. "You are my strength," she said. "When I was lost in grief, you showed me hope again. I give you my trust, my love, and my future." Dakota's deep voice was thick with emotion as he carefully laid his large hand over her growing belly. "I vow to be father to this child, to love and protect you both until my last breath." His dark eyes shone. "You have given me back my heart. I will spend my life proving worthy of that gift." Martha Ellison dabbed at her eyes with her handkerchief as Ruth began to sing an old hymn. Other voices joined in, the melody rising sweet and clear into the night sky. The Comanche elders added their own blessing song, the ancient words twining with the hymn in perfect harmony. Above them, stars wheeled in their eternal dance. The fire crackled and sparked, sending glowing embers up to join the countless lights overhead. For a precious moment, the troubles below seemed to fall away. Here on the ridge, witnessed by friends and sky and sacred flame, 2 souls had found their way home to each other. Tom Wilson raised his cup. To the bride and groom. The small gathering echoed his toast, their faces glowing with shared joy. Nera leaned against Dakota's broad chest as he wrapped his arms around her. She had not felt such peace since before her first husband's death. Looking up at Dakota's gentle smile, she knew with certainty that this was right, this was where she belonged. They shared a simple feast of bread, dried meat, and late summer berries. The women had brought a small cake, carefully carried up the trail. Songs and stories filled the night air as the fire burned low. When the moon rose high overhead, it was time to descend. Dakota helped Nera onto his horse, then swung up behind her. The others gathered their things, preparing to make their way down by torchlight. "God bless and keep you both," Reverend Matthews said softly as they passed. The couple rode slowly down the trail, Dakota's arms secure around Nera as she nestled against him. Their hearts were full of hope and dreams of the future they would build together. But in the shadows beyond the firelight's reach, unseen eyes had watched the ceremony. 3 of Clayton Draper's men crouched in the darkness, their faces hard in the starlight. They waited until the wedding party had passed before slipping away to report what they had seen. The night held its breath, suspended between joy and danger, as Dakota and Nera made their way home to their cabin, their love a bright flame against the gathering dark. The night wrapped Dakota and Nera's cabin in velvet darkness. Inside, they lay peaceful in their first hours as husband and wife, the evening celebration still warming their hearts. Crickets chirped their endless song outside, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of pine through the window. Dakota woke. First, something wasn't right. The air felt thick, wrong, smoke. His eyes shot open as acrid fumes filled his lungs. "Naira!" He shook her shoulder roughly. "Wake up." Orange light flickered through widening gaps in the walls. The roof creaked ominously above them. Naira's eyes flew open as she coughed, disoriented. "What? Fire?" Dakota scooped her into his arms, wrapping her in a blanket. The door was already starting to smoke. He kicked it open with one powerful thrust. They burst out into chaos. Flames engulfed the back of the cabin, reaching hungry fingers toward the sky. The heat hit them like a wall. From somewhere in the darkness, a rifle cracked. Splinters exploded from the doorframe beside Dakota's head. Down! He pushed Naira behind a water barrel, shielding her with his body. More shots rang out, followed by pounding hoofbeats. Dark shapes moved against the starlit sky, riders melting into the night like spirits. A terrible screaming rose from the corral. Their horses thrashed against their ropes, eyes rolling white with terror as flames licked at the wooden posts. Dakota sprinted toward them, ducking low. "Stay hidden." He called to Naira. The corral was already starting to collapse. Dakota slashed through the horses' lead ropes with his knife. The animals bolted past him, disappearing into the darkness. He grabbed 2 buckets, racing to the water barrel where Naira crouched. "Help!" "Me!" he shouted, passing her a bucket. They formed a desperate line between barrel and cabin, throwing water on the flames. But it was like trying to drown a mountain. The fire roared louder, feeding on dry wood and summer-baked timber. Naira stumbled, dropping her bucket. Her face contorted in pain as she clutched her belly. "The baby!" she gasped. "Something's wrong." Dakota's heart turned to ice. No, it's too soon. He caught her as her knees buckled. The roof of their cabin gave way with a thunderous crash, sending a column of sparks spiraling into the night sky. The heat drove them back, step by step, until they could only watch as their home burned. Through the long hours until dawn, they huddled together on a ridge overlooking the inferno. Naira's pain came in waves, each spasm drawing a whimper from her lips. Dakota held her close, his large hands gentle on her shoulders, though inside he was screaming with helpless rage. The sky began to lighten, painting the smoke pink and gold. In the gray light of morning, their losses became clear. The cabin was a skeleton of blackened beams. The garden lay trampled, fence posts smoldering. Even the water barrel had split from the heat, precious liquid soaking into parched earth. Naira's grip on Dakota's arm suddenly tightened. Her face went white. "The baby's coming," she whispered. "I can feel it." Terror gripped Dakota's heart. They were hours from help, with nothing but the clothes on their backs. The nearest doctor was in town, but after last night's attack, who could they trust? Another spasm racked Naira's body. She cried out, doubling over. The sound tore through Dakota like a knife. He had to do something, had to save them both. The church. The thought came like a revelation. Whatever else the Reverend was, he had blessed their union. His wife knew about healing. It was their only hope. Dakota gathered Naira into his arms, as carefully as if she were made of glass. She felt so small against his chest, her face drawn with pain. "Hold on, beloved," he murmured. "Just hold on." The trail down to town stretched before them like a ribbon, winding through scrub oak and scattered pines. Dakota set out with determined strides, each step measured to jostle Naira as little as possible. The morning sun climbed higher, beating down on his shoulders. Naira drifted in and out of awareness as he walked. Sometimes she would tense, fighting back cries of pain. Other times she went frighteningly still, her breath shallow against his neck. Dakota's arms burned, but he refused to stop. Each minute could mean life or death for mother and child. Behind them, thin wreaths of smoke still rose from the ashes of their home. Everything they had built together, every small comfort and hope for the future, had been reduced to cinders in a single night of hatred. But Dakota's heart held firm. They had survived. They were together. And as long as breath remained in his body, he would fight to keep his new family safe. One step at a time, he carried his precious burden down the trail. While the merciless sun climbed higher in a bone-dry sky, Sweat streamed down Dakota's face as he staggered into Los Arbos, each step an effort of will. The morning sun beat down mercilessly, but he barely noticed the heat. His entire world had narrowed to Naira's labored breathing and the steady placement of his feet. One after another, Naira moaned softly against his chest, her fingers clutching weakly at his shirt. "Hold on," he whispered. "We're almost there." The town's main street stretched before them, dusty and quiet in the Sunday morning light. A few early risers stopped in their tracks, staring at the unlikely pair. Windows creaked open. Doors swung wide. Word spread like wildfire through Los Arbos. The Apache and his Comanche bride had come seeking help. Soon, a crowd gathered, maintaining a cautious distance. Whispers rippled through the onlookers. Some faces twisted with horror at the sight of Naira's pain, while others softened with pity. A child pointed at Dakota's soot-stained clothes, asking loudly what had happened. "Hush now," his mother pulled him back, but her own eyes were wide with concern. The church stood at the end of the street, its white-painted walls gleaming in the morning light. Dakota's legs trembled with exhaustion as he climbed the steps. The preacher stood in the doorway, his face a mask of indecision. Behind him, shadows moved in the church, deacons and elders watching. "Reverend," Dakota's voice was rough from smoke and fatigue. "Please." The preacher shifted uncomfortably, glancing over Dakota's shoulder. Following his gaze, Dakota saw Clayton Draper's wagon rolling up the street, dust billowing behind it. The cattle baron's influence hung heavy in the air. I'm not sure," the preacher began. "Not sure?" A sharp voice cut through the murmurs. Martha Ellison pushed through the crowd, her sister Ruth close behind. Other widows emerged from the gathering, faces set with determination. "This is God's house, Reverend. Since when do we turn away those in need?" "The church ain't meant for," the preacher faltered under Martha's stern gaze. "For what?" Ruth demanded. "For a mother about to bring new life into this world? For a husband protecting his wife?" She turned to the crowd. "What sort of Christians would we be?" The widows formed a line on the church steps, a barrier of bonnets and worn shawls between Dakota and the growing tension in the street. Martha stepped forward and pushed the heavy doors wide open. "Bring her inside, Dakota. Quick now." Relief flooded through him as he carried Naira into the cool darkness of the church. The familiar scent of wood polish and lamp oil filled the air. Martha directed him to lay Naira on a pallet of quilts near the altar, hastily assembled by the other women. "Ruth, get water boiling," Martha commanded. "Sarah, fetch clean linens from the baptismal chest. Mary, we'll need your healing herbs." The women scattered to their tasks with practiced efficiency. Outside, voices rose in anger. "Clayton Draper's." Deep tones carried through the windows. "This is a disgrace." That savage burned down his own shack to win sympathy. But other voices answered back. The blacksmith's wife spoke up. "Those two were just married yesterday. Why would they burn their own home?" "And who was shooting in the night?" added the cooper. "We all heard the rifles." Dakota knelt beside Naira, trying to shut out the dimbumba. Argument outside. She gripped his hand as another contraction seized her, her dark eyes wide with fear. "I cannot do this alone," she whispered. "You're not alone," he answered softly in Apache, then switched to English. "I'm here. These women are here." Martha knelt on Naira's other side, her weathered hands gentle as she felt the young woman's forehead. "The baby's coming fast," she said, "but you're strong, child. We'll see you through." The church filled with purposeful movement. Women bustled in and out, carrying steaming water, clean cloths, and bundles of herbs. They worked together seamlessly, years of frontier living having taught them how to handle crisis. Dakota found himself nudged slightly back as the women took charge of Naira's care. He remained close enough to hold her hand but gave them room to work. Closing his eyes, he began to pray silently in Apache, ancient words of healing and protection that his grandmother had taught him long ago. The morning light streamed through the church windows, painting patterns on the wooden floor. Outside, the crowd had grown larger. The Drapers' angry voices still carried, but they seemed to be losing ground. More and more townsfolk were speaking up, questioning the night's violence. "Ain't right, burning folks out," someone declared. "Don't matter who they are. They're married proper now," another added. Preacher blessed them himself. Inside, Nira's labor intensified. She alternated between gripping Takota's hand fiercely and lying exhausted between contractions. The widows moved around her like a coordinated dance, wiping her brow, checking her progress, murmuring encouragement. Ruth began to sing softly, an old hymn about God's mercy. Other women joined in, their voices rising and falling like a gentle tide. The familiar melody seemed to soothe Nira, giving her something to focus on besides the pain. Takota kept his silent vigil, his large frame somehow less imposing as he knelt beside his wife. His prayers mingled with the women's hymns, two traditions, weaving together in the sacred space. Outside, the morning wore on, and gradually the angry voices faded. Those who remained spoke in hushed tones, waiting. Martha positioned herself at Nira's feet, her capable hands ready. "Soon now," she said quietly, "the child is eager to meet this world." Nira's grip on Takota's hand tightened until his fingers went numb, but he didn't flinch. "You are stronger than the pain," he told her in her own language, the Comanche words feeling strange but right on his tongue. "Stronger than their hatred, stronger than the fire." She nodded, tears streaming down her face. Then her body tensed with the final, mighty effort of bringing new life into the world. The women's voices rose in encouragement. Takota held his breath, praying harder than he ever had before. A thin cry split the air, the first voice of Apache's breath. Child born to two worlds, delivered in God's house by the hands of frontier women who chose love over fear. Shadows lengthened across the church floor as afternoon faded into evening. The women had lit oil lamps, their flames casting a warm glow through the sacred space. Nira lay on the quilted pallet, her face gleaming with sweat as another contraction seized her. Takota knelt beside her, his large frame bent close as he dabbed her forehead with a damp cloth. "Breathe deep," he murmured, speaking the words in Apache first, then English, like the wind through canyon walls. Martha Ellison checked Nira's progress again, her experienced hands gentle but sure. "The baby's turned proper now," she announced, quietly to the other women, "but it'll be some hours yet." Nira gripped Takota's hand as pain racked her body. Her dark hair had come loose from its careful braids, spreading across the makeshift pillow like a fan. The women had changed her out of her travel-stained dress into a clean nightgown, but even that was now soaked with sweat. "I can't," she whispered, between contractions. "I'm not strong enough." "You are." Takota's deep voice carried absolute conviction. He leaned closer, speaking so only she could hear. "You survived soldiers and loss. You faced down the whole town. You walked through fire. Last night," his thumb traced circles on her palm, "this child is your victory song." The preacher had been hovering uncertainly near the altar, caught between his conscience and the pressure from powerful men. But as the hours wore on and Nira's labor intensified, something shifted in his weathered face. Perhaps it was the way Takota tended to his wife with such reverence, or how the community's women had rallied around the couple without hesitation. Finally, as the evening bells tolled 6 o'clock, the preacher sank to his knees beside the pallet. His voice trembled slightly as he began to pray. "Lord God, maker of all life, protect this mother and child. Guide them through the valley of shadow into your light." Ruth Ellison joined in, then her sister Martha, then the other women. There, voices rose and fell like gentle waves, a current of faith that seemed to bear Nira up through her pain. Even Takota, who held to different beliefs, felt the power in their unified petition. Outside, the town had grown quiet as night approached. Most of the curious onlookers had dispersed, though a few sympathetic souls maintained a vigil on the Fa. Church steps. The draper's man could be seen as darker shadows against the twilight. Watching from across the street. Inside, the hours crept by with agonizing slowness. Nira alternated between periods of intense labor and brief, exhausted rest. The women worked in shifts, some napping on church pews while others tended to the laboring mother. Takota never left her side, his massive frame somehow making space for the bustling activity around them. As midnight approached, Martha's expression grew concerned. "The baby's small," she murmured to her sister. "Coming early ain't helped matters." But there was nothing to do but wait and pray. Takota continued his quiet encouragement, mixing Apache wisdom with frontier common sense. He told Naira stories of his people's strong women, of births in desert heat and mountain storms. His voice remained steady even when her grip threatened to crush his fingers. The church windows began to show the first hint of pre-dawn gray when Naira's labors suddenly intensified. Her cries grew sharper, more urgent. Martha quickly positioned herself at the foot of the pallet while the other women gathered close, ready to help. "Now, child," Martha commanded, "push with all you've got." Naira bore down, her face contorted with effort. Dakota supported her shoulders, letting her brace against his strength. The preacher's prayers grew louder, mingling with the women's. Encouragement. Suddenly, a thin wail pierced the pre-dawn quiet, a sound of defiance, of life refusing to be denied. Martha worked quickly, cleaning the tiny infant and checking his breathing. "A boy," she announced, her voice thick with emotion. "Small, but he's got good lungs." Tears streamed down Naira's face as Martha placed the swaddled bundle in her arms. The baby's skin was darker than hers, but lighter than Dakota's, a perfect blend of his heritage. His tiny fists waved in the air as he continued to cry, not the robust wails of a full-term infant, but strong enough to declare his presence to the world. "Welcome, little warrior," Naira whispered in Comanche. Then, switching to English, all could understand she spoke his name, Joseph. It had been her first husband's name, chosen now to honor his memory and the land that was his legacy. She looked up at Dakota, her eyes bright with tears and fierce joy. "He has a father still," she said softly, "if you'll claim him." Dakota's hands that could break a wild horse or lift a fallen tree, trembled as he reached for the baby. With infinite gentleness, he cradled his new son. The contrast was striking. The tiny infant nearly lost in his massive palms, yet perfectly secure. "My son," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Blood of my heart, if not my body." The women who had kept vigil through the night wiped tears from their eyes. Even the preacher had to clear his throat several times before he could speak. "Shall we pray to bless this child?" They formed a circle around the small family, Apache warrior, Comanche mother, and their newborn son. The preacher's words rolled out in the growing dawn light, asking protection for this child of two worlds. The women added their own blessings. Practical prayers for health and strength. As sunrise painted the church windows in gold, word spread through the waking town. Mother and baby had survived the night. Townsfolk gathered outside, speaking in hushed voices. Many who had stood silent before now openly celebrated the birth, seeing it as a sign of hope. But not everyone shared in the joy. Clayton Draper and his son Elias watched from the shadows of the mercantile, their faces set in hard lines. The elder Draper spat into the dust. "This ain't over," he growled to his companions. "That spring will be ours one way or another." Yet his words carried less weight than before. The sight of Dakota's tenderness, Naira's courage, and their communities' compassion had begun to shift hearts. The tide of sympathy, slow but steady as the sunrise, was turning in favor of the unlikely family. Inside the church, Naira dozed while Dakota kept watch, the baby sleeping peacefully in a basket padded with clean linens. The women moved quietly around them, tidying up from the night's work. Morning light streamed through the windows, touching the scene with gold. A new day, a new life, a new chance for understanding in the harsh frontier land. Morning sunlight streamed through the church windows, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floors. The bells of Los Arbos rang out 6 clear times, their bronze tones echoing through the quiet valley. Inside the church, Naira rested on a makeshift bed in the corner, her newborn son Joseph sleeping peacefully against her chest. Dakota sat nearby, his broad shoulders bent forward as he watched over his new family. The preacher entered quietly, clutching a weathered leather folder to his chest. His face showed the strain of a sleepless night, but his eyes held a determined light. Behind him, several townsfolk filed in, including Martha and Ruth Ellison, who had helped with the birth. "Miss Naira," the preacher said softly, approaching her bedside, "there is something you need to see." He paused, glancing at the papers in his hands. "After your first husband died, he left some documents in my care. I have been remiss in bringing them forward sooner." Dakota straightened, his dark eyes fixed on the folder. The preacher pulled out a single yellowed document, its edges frayed but the official seal still clearly visible. "This is a treaty deed," he explained, holding it where Naira could see. "It grants legal ownership of the spring and surrounding lands to your people. Your late husband was named as guardian of the water rights." Naira's fingers trembled as she reached for the paper. "Joseph told me such a paper existed, but after the soldiers—" She swallowed hard. "I never found it among his things." The church. Doors burst open, flooding the space with harsh morning light. Clayton Draper strode in, his son Elias close behind. Their boots echoed against the floorboards like gunshots. "What's this nonsense?" Clayton demanded, his face reddening as he spotted the document. "Some convenient paper appearing just when you need it?" The preacher stood his ground, though his voice shook slightly. "This deed has been in my possession since Joseph's death. It bears the territorial governor's seal and signature. Forgery." Elias spat, taking a threatening step forward, but Dakota rose to his full height, and the younger Draper retreated. "The water belongs to no one man." Dakota's deep voice filled the church. "The Creator made it to sustain all life. Cattle, crops, children, all need to drink." He gestured to the gathered townsfolk. "Your neighbors' wells run dry while you plot to control the spring." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the growing crowd. Martha Ellison stepped forward, her gray head held high. "We've watched you buy up land, squeeze out smaller ranchers," she said to Clayton. "But water? That's going too far." The preacher raised the deed higher. "I call for an oath of truth before God and these witnesses. Mr. Draper, did you know of this treaty when you tried to force marriage on Naira?" Clayton's face twisted. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the morning cool. Behind him, several of his ranch hands shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances. "I don't answer to," Clayton began, but one of his oldest hands cut him off. "He knew," the weathered cowboy said quietly. "Found the survey markers last spring with the tribe's signs on them. Boss said to pull them up, keep quiet about it." A shocked hush fell over the church. Then, one by one, Clayton's men began moving. Away from him, some removing their hats in shame. Elias looked around wildly, seeing their support crumbling. "You can't believe this Indian-loving preacher," he snarled. But his words rang hollow in the still air. The preacher's voice grew stronger. "The deed will be registered with the territorial court today. The spring belongs legally to Naira's people, with rights shared among all who live peacefully in the valley." Little Joseph stirred, letting out a thin cry. Mira soothed him, her eyes meeting Dakota's with quiet triumph. The townsfolk pressed closer, no longer afraid to show their support. Clayton's authority, built on fear and greed, was dissolving like morning frost. His remaining men slipped out the church doors, leaving him and Elias standing alone. The older man's shoulders sagged as he finally faced the truth of his actions. 20 years building this ranch," he muttered. "All for nothing." "Not nothing." Dakota replied evenly. "Your cattle still need water. But now you must share like the rest of us." Martha and Ruth had already begun preparing the rectory's small room, making it comfortable for Naira's recovery. As the morning wore on, the Drapers retreated to their ranch, their power broken. Townsfolk came and went, some bringing food, others offering quiet congratulations to the new family. By evening, Naira and Dakota rested in the rectory's clean bed, their son swaddled between them. The spring's clear water would continue to flow for all, just as the Creator intended. And in the small room, blessed by answered prayers and long-delayed justice, peace finally settled over the unlikely family who had helped truth come to light. The preacher sat at his desk nearby, carefully copying the deed for court records. His pen scratched softly against paper, recording not just legal ownership, but the day a small frontier town chose right over might and love over fear. A week after the confrontation at the church, wagons and horses lined the path to the spring. The morning sun caught the water's sparkle as it burbled from the earth. Townsfolk gathered in clusters while 2 engineers marked spots for new irrigation channels with wooden stakes. Naira sat beneath a cottonwood tree, little Joseph sleeping in her arms. Her heart swelled as she watched native elders from both Apache and Comanche people seated with dignity at the meeting table, their voices carrying equal weight as the town council's. Dakota stood tall nearby, helping translate when needed, his presence bridging the gap between worlds. "The water will feed 4 main channels," the lead engineer explained, pointing to his drawings. "Every ranch gets its share, measured fair and square." Martha and Ruth Ellison, their gray heads nodding in approval, began a sweet hymn about living waters. Other voices joined in, the melody floating across the spring-fed meadow. Children splashed at the water's edge, their laughter mixing with the song. Tom Weber, the town blacksmith, approached Naira and Dakota with his hat in his hands. "Me and some fellows, we'd like to help build you a proper cabin," he offered. "Got lumber already cut. Seems right after." "Well, after everything." Dakota clasped the man's hand, emotion flickering across his usually stoic features. "Much obliged," he said simply. As afternoon mellowed into evening, folks shared a meal together on blankets spread near the spring. The territorial judge signed the new water agreements, making them official. Naira watched her son sleep peacefully, untouched by the hatred that had nearly destroyed their lives. Later, as stars began freckling the purple dusk, Naira and Dakota stood by the spring. She leaned against his solid strength, feeling the steady beat of his heart. "I'm not afraid anymore," she whispered, her voice clear and sure. "Not of laughing, not of loving, not of living." Dakota's arm tightened around her shoulders as the evening star rose over their healing land. The new cabin gleamed in the autumn sunlight, its fresh-cut timber and stone chimney a testament to many helping hands. Though modest in size, it stood proudly near the spring, where water flowed clear and steady through the newly dug channels. Inside, Naira hummed softly to baby Joseph while stirring a pot of venison stew. The aroma of cornbread baking in the iron stove filled the warm air. Outside, the steady thunk of Dakota's axe split the afternoon quiet as he added to their woodpile. Sarah Miller arrived first, balancing a blackberry pie in her weathered hands. Then came the Martinez family with iron nails for the barn they planned to raise next month. More neighbors followed, Apache and Comanche elders walking alongside settler families, each bringing what they could share. As twilight approached, they gathered around the long table Dakota had built. The preacher stood, his Bible worn but his smile genuine, blessing little Joseph with words of peace. The tribal elders followed, speaking ancient prayers in their languages, wisdom passing from old ways to new. Martha Ellison's clear voice lifted in amazing grace, and soon others joined in. Then 2 ravens, an elder, led a traditional blessing song, the rhythms blending naturally with the hymn's echoes. Children sat cross-legged nearby, wide-eyed at the harmony of it all. In the deepening dusk, Dakota found Naira by the doorway, his large hand gentle on her shoulder. He looked into her eyes and repeated the words that had changed everything. "You don't need to pretend." Naira's smile lit her face as she held Joseph close. "I never will again," she answered softly. The last rays of sun caught the spring's surface, making it shimmer like beaten gold. Water burbled steadily through the channels, reaching every corner of the valley, a promise kept, a future flowing free. If something in this story whispered to your spirit, stay a while. Subscribe and come back tomorrow. The next story may be the one you didn't know you needed.